Hello, I'm Locke Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines where my guest is Clary. He's a representative of a movement or organization called Convention of the States. Do you know there's two ways to amend the Constitution? I was only taught one. Congress proposes amendments, they send it to the states to be ratified. There's another way. The state legislatures can meet and decide they want to propose changes, and then it's sent to the states. And that's called a Convention of the States. So join us on the next Legal Lines with attorney Clary.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a Legal Lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power. And I want you to know if you're injured, Louisiana law grants you a variety of claims to make sure you're fully compensated. It's generally chopped up into several categories, the first being general damages. That's going to compensate you for your mental and physical pain and suffering, your scarring, disability, functional limitations, your loss of enjoyment of life. Also, it will compensate your family, frankly, for your loss of affection. It's called loss of consortium claim. Next category is specific damages. Those would be, say, for example, past and future lost wages, past and future medical expenses. You also have a claim sometimes for what's called punishment damages or punitive damages, typically only available when you're injured by a drunk party. Finally, you're entitled to legal interest from the date you file your lawsuit until you're paid and court costs. So my Legal Lines tip to you from me, Locke Meredith, make sure you know what your claims are.
This has been Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I'm very pleased to have on the show for the first time Clary. He's an attorney here in Baton Rouge, and he's heading up with a group on the media side called Convention of States. Dale.
Locke, thanks for having me today.
Pleasure having you come in. Let's kind of dive into this thing. You know, you've been a practicing lawyer for over 30 years.
Right.
You practice in varying ways, a lot of contract and engineering and
a lot of construction stuff, engineering and design and construction litigation, correct.
And yet you're part of the Convention of the States. I don't think most folks even know what that is. So tell them.
It is a constitutionally based project to reel in a runaway federal government.
Okay, let's say that a little slower. Constitutionally based. What do you mean?
Means in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, there is a procedure for the states to amend the Constitution, and it's never been used before, and that's what we're doing, is using that procedure.
Okay, so the first part is you want to amend the United States Constitution.
Correct.
And the reason stated is to
reel in what we call a runaway federal government.
Okay,
and I think most people understand that the federal government cannot control its spending. They're spending like a bunch of drunken sailors up there. Most people understand the federal government is intruding into every aspect of our lives, from health care to every kind of regulation in the world, to now telling us what marriage is, to now telling us who can go to the bathroom with whom. And that's a runaway federal government. This was anticipated when they wrote the Constitution.
Which is remarkable.
That's why, well, remember now, those people who were there then had seen a dominating, centralized, powerful government. Called a king, right. And so they put in some things to keep us from having kings, and this is one of those provisions, is the ability for the states to reel in a government that gets too big, that becomes king-like.
And when we say the government, we're talking about the federal government,
yes,
not the state government or the local government.
In fact, it is the state government which is doing the reeling in, and that's what's in Article 5 of the Constitution.
So the big picture is we've got a federal government that, in your view, and those who are part of this movement, view as being out of control, and the only way to rein in that big federal government is via an amendment of the Constitution? Or
a series of amendments, but the project itself, the Convention of States project, seeks primarily to impose some fiscal, financial restraints on the federal government, to perhaps impose term limits on not just Congress, but other people in the federal government, and then just to generally lower the power and the jurisdiction of the federal government.
Well, I think the beauty of this, as far as I'm concerned, is the federal government can't really do a dadgum thing about this. Explain to the folks.
Well, that's the way the procedure is set up in the Constitution. It says 2/3 applications of the legislature requires Congress. The word is shall. Lawyers know this word shall. It means Congress has to do it if 2/3 of the states file the application for this convention to come together to propose amendments.
So let's go through the processes, and let's make a distinction between the federal government and the state government. And the Congress, the federal Congress, and then you also have your legislatures in the state.
Exactly.
So you're having the state legislatures telling the federal Congress, we're going to have a convention and we're going to try and amend the Constitution, and Congress, you can't do anything about it, and Mr. President, you can't do anything about it, and you're not involved.
Correct. other than Congress shall call the Constitution if 34 states apply for it, the convention, excuse me. And it's not a constitutional convention.
Explain the difference.
The convention does not have the legal authority to rewrite the Constitution. All this convention of states would be allowed to do is to propose amendments, which then, if the states choose to ratify them, just like any other amendments and all the other amendments that have come through, if the states choose to ratify those amendments, then they become part of the Constitution.
You know, when I was a kid, about the only thing I ever heard of how you amend the United States Constitution was Congress would be the one who initiates the process.
And typically that has been what's happened. All of the 26, 27, excuse me for not remembering, but all of the constitutional amendments that we have now came through that way. This method, although it's in the Constitution, has never been used, and we're trying to use it.
So, truth be told, the Constitution of the United States says Congress can initiate the process to try and amend the United States Constitution, or 2/3 of the state legislatures.
Correct, exactly. There's two processes, both of them built into Article 5.
Okay.
And that's what we're doing, is using the other one, subsection B, if you will.
All right, let's talk about the process, because you know, you can get the numbers in your head, and the 2/3 and the 3/4 bit getting messed up. So explain to the folks what has to happen.
Well, first 34 states, or 2/3 of the states, have to file the similar or same applications. The state legislatures are the ones that do it. It's not the governor, it's not anybody else, it's the state legislatures, also specifically mentioned in the Article 5.
So not only is the federal Congress and the president and the court system not involved, the governors of these states are not involved.
Correct.
It's just the representatives and the senators, if they have it.
Exactly. The legislatures is the term that's used in the Article 5.
And the reason for that, obviously, I assume, would be because they are the folks who are closest to the people.
Right.
They're most accountable.
We can pick up the phone or send an email to our legislators here in the House here in Louisiana. You're going to get a response.
That's right.
You do that with somebody in Congress or the Senate, in the U.S. Senate, you maybe will get a response, and it may be a canned letter. And that's not a knock. That's just a matter of simple math.
You're dealing with millions and millions
Correct.
of constituents when you're a senator or a congressman, but when you're at the state level, it's thousands or 1,000.
Correct, and they're more responsive, and I think that's part of the gist of, that's part of why they did it. That's why they wanted the legislatures to have the power.
It's getting the power back to the people.
Right. So if 34 states file the application for the convention to be held, Congress shall call the convention, and then we have this convention. The states then select their delegates, give their delegates their instructions, and they'll be called commissioners. And then the commissioners will go to this convention, and they'll have committee meetings, and they'll have General Assembly meetings, and they will make proposals for amendments to the Constitution. Again, which have to be limited to reeling in a runaway federal government.
We'll talk about each of those parts of the process. So the first thing that has to happen is a state, say Louisiana, and I'm very proud to say our state has actually already done this.
And this process has already started across the country. Louisiana became this session the 8th state to pass the resolution.
So you were involved in the process here in the state of Louisiana. So you had to meet with legislators both on the Senate side and on the House side, and explain it and educate them about the process, and then they got some document or something that said what they wanted to do?
They have a sample resolution that's on the Convention of States website. You can go see it, and we basically gave it to them, and then frankly, we have some people in the legislature who already knew about this and have been on it from the beginning. They were on the ground running. We didn't have to do much with those guys. They took it and ran with it, and frankly, they were the sponsors in both chambers.
And is this a formal bill that is submitted by a House member and a senator?
It's an actual formal resolution.
Okay.
It was HCR 2 last year, and I forget the HCR number this year, but actually it was their actual formal resolutions.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, when you go to the legislature.
Official act of the legislature.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, so they pick the issues that they want to be addressed at the convention for possible amendment of the Constitution? Is that the way it works?
Those are already in the sample resolution, and those were in the resolution that was approved by the Louisiana legislature this summer. That's correct.
Okay, and so they then have a majority vote, and that's it. All right, we'll continue it on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. My special guest, Dale Clary, will be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a legal lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power, and I want you to know if you're injured, Louisiana law grants you a variety of claims to make sure you're fully compensated. It's generally chopped up into several categories, the first being general damages. That's going to compensate you for your mental and physical pain and suffering, your scarring, disability, functional limitations, your loss of enjoyment of life. Also, it will compensate your family, frankly, for your loss of affection. It's called loss of consortium claim. Next category is specific damages. Those would be, say, for example, past and future lost wages, past and future medical expenses. You also have a claim sometimes for what's called punishment damages or punitive damages, typically only available when you're injured by a drunk party. Finally, you're entitled to legal interest from the date you file your lawsuit until you're paid and court costs. So my legal lines tip to you from me, Locke Meredith. Make sure you know what your claims are.
This has been Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I'm pleased to have on the show for the first time Dale Clary. He's an attorney here in Baton Rouge, and he's helping head up a Convention of the States organization's push to amend the United States Constitution. Dale, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's dive back in and pick up where we were. So Louisiana has passed the resolution in its legislature. The governor's not involved. The courts aren't involved. And that is now sent to Congress?
Correct. At some point it'll be sent to Congress once there's 34 states that have passed it, but Louisiana's done with the application process.
So what we had to do as a legislature at this point in time has been done?
Yes, and we had some very key members of the House and some very key members of the Senate who, frankly, they went around the room educating everybody about it. And they didn't do it just in the session, they did it in advance of the session.
Nobody knows about
during
this.
the session. And that's what we've been trying to do, is educate people about this.
So it's wonderful that Louisiana is part of, as I understand it, 8 other states who have done this.
Correct.
So we need 22 more states rather, their legislatures to do the same thing, right?
Correct. Yeah.
That sounds quite daunting.
It's not as daunting as you think. It's been passed in Alaska, Alabama, Florida, Oklahoma, and I'm not going to remember them all right now, but it's been passed in a total of 8 states. But it's been filed in over 40 states.
That's the good news.
It's already been through the legislative process in a number of other states, and in some cases it has failed primarily because a lot of people just don't understand it. Everybody that I have talked to, once they understand it, and everybody I've seen, once they understand it, they say, we got to do this.
Well, and I would think just the political mess that we find ourselves in today and the dysfunction of the government and seemingly the Congress and everything, the Supreme Court where we got 5 people telling 330 million people what they can do and what they can't do.
Well, and the thing that's going to draw
motivates.
Exactly, but the thing that's going to draw everybody together, there was as U.S. Senator Tom Coburn wrote a book called The Debt Bomb, and he's one of the key speakers for the Convention of States. He says it's now a $20 trillion debt that nobody is reeling in. Nobody is saying, let's slow down the spending. In fact, what was it yesterday? There's a new concurrent resolution to extend the debt again. And we're spending money we don't have. We're spending our children's money. We're spending our grandchildren's money. Exactly. And not that we're old enough to have grandchildren, but we're spending money we don't have. And that alone is going to draw America together, regardless of your political stripes. We've got to bring that in somehow.
So, with the fact that you have 40 other states already in some process of making this happen, it sounds like it's probably more likely to happen. So what's the next step? You get 34 states, they all pass their resolutions, now you send the 34 resolutions to Congress, right. And Congress does what?
Well, and for example, before we get to exactly what Congress does, is I know that probably it's going to pass in Texas next year. I know they're working hard in Arkansas. I know they're even working hard in New York. I've been seeing a lot of stuff that they're doing up there.
That would blow my mind.
They're working hard in Mississippi. I think all of those states are probably going to pass next year, and I think a lot of other states that I just don't know about as we sit here today. But once you have the 34 states that approve the application, 34 legislatures, Congress then is required by law, the word is shall, call the convention.
So when they call the convention, what are they doing? Picking the place and time?
That's pretty much it, because the rules have already been written. It's like any legislative body, you have to have rules of how are we going to do this.
Right.
Our legislature has their rules, the House and the Senate have their own separate rules, and it's the same, I think, for every legislature. So there's already a draft set of rules that the Convention of States Project has put together so everybody can see, here's how it's going to happen.
And so when these resolutions are passed, for example, by the 8 states that have done it so far, has it included passing those rules?
No, that'll be the next step. Once the Congress calls the convention, the states will have to select their delegates, and frankly, I don't even think they're waiting for the call. They're talking now about it. Who's going to go and represent the state of Louisiana, which is going to have 1 vote? It won't be 4 votes for Kentucky, 10 votes for California.
And that's a big frickin' deal.
That means the vote of Louisiana will be exactly as powerful as the vote of New York.
That's
or
right.
California.
Or Florida, or Texas,
right.
or although I love Texas.
Right, I love all those states. But it's 1 vote per state. And so, but Louisiana will have to decide who's going to be the commissioners, as they're going to call them. That'll go from Louisiana. And then we'll also give the state of Louisiana, the legislature, will write the mandate, as we would call it in Louisiana, the instructions for these commissioners to go from Louisiana to the convention. Here's what you're going to do, and here's what you can't do.
Interesting. So are the rules for the representatives that Louisiana sends to the convention, or are the rules a document that will control the activity of all 34 or more participating states?
Good question. Two different sets of rules. One of them is your rules for your commissioners. Here's what you're going to go do. Here's the amendments you're going to go look at. Here's the ones you're going to talk about. Here's what you can vote for. Here's what we want you to vote for. Here's what we don't want you to vote for. In fact, in the legislative session this summer, there was a lot of discussion by some of those who had doubts about the Convention of State Project is, well, we don't want them to go back and rewrite the slavery stuff that we've already gone to war over. And it was, I don't mean it to say it was a joke, but it was like nobody has any intention of rewriting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Well, wouldn't that have to be in the resolution?
It would have to be in the resolution.
So
the
the resolution has already narrowed and defined what these representatives can do.
Exactly.
And then it's going to be even more further refined by the rules or directives that our legislature would give our representatives.
Call it the instructions. The legislature is going to give the instructions to these commissioners to say, here's what you're going to be able to do.
And so every one of the 8 states that have already acted by passing the resolution, they have an agreement, because I assume they all the same resolution in essence?
They all have essentially the same resolution. In Louisiana, it was edited slightly, but the substance is still the same.
Okay, and the resolution has identified what, 6 main topics or 3 main topics chopped up?
General topics. One of them is fiscal restraint. One of them is
define that. Tell me what you're talking about.
Spending limits. Maybe a balanced budget amendment. Maybe you're not going to be able to spend X amount of dollars compared to last year. Maybe you're not going to be able to do taxing on certain things. Anything related to money and spending of money.
Okay. In other words, quit spending money you don't have.
Right. Like we were just talking about, $20
and
trillion.
The money you do spend, do it right.
Correct.
And not wastefully.
Right.
Okay.
And anything that falls into that bag is considered fiscal or financial restraints on the federal government.
Because it's a broad term, fiscal, to some degree. Is it more defined than that in the resolution?
No, it's not.
Okay.
So it is deliberately broad to give the commissioners who go to the convention the flexibility and the freedom to come up with stuff that maybe we haven't thought of yet.
But they're not going to bring up slavery or anything else. It's fiscal, period.
Right, and nobody wants to. That's the crazy thing,
Right.
even though it came up in the legislature this summer.
So what's the second
The second
main
topic
issue?
is, I'll call it just term limits, but it's term limits not just for members of Congress, it's also could be for any other federal officials.
Including the courts?
Including the courts.
Well, that's
including the Supreme Court.
Good news, I think.
I think so too. There are some people will say that won't change any of the opinions written by the Supreme Court, but I think it will change their perspective.
Well, it makes them accountable. Right now, those guys and gals are up there for a lifetime, and they don't have any accountability to anybody.
And I think some of the thinking might be is, once you hit 85 years old, I'm sorry, you may be a wonderful person, a great jurist, a wonderful judge, but maybe at some point it's time to slow down a little bit. But I think mainly it's because the length of your time on the court increases your juridical your power.
All right.
And this whole thing is to limit the power.
All right, we'll continue this on the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with Legal Lines. My special guest, Dale Clary. We're talking about Convention of the States.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Pleased to have on the show Dale Clary. He's an attorney here in Baton Rouge, and he's helping spearhead a movement called the Convention of States. Dale, let's dive back in. So to summarize quickly, you get 34 states to pass a resolution that says we want a convention of these 34, or maybe it's more states, to propose amendments to the Constitution of the United States.
Correct.
Okay? And those resolutions that each of the states pass are very specific and narrow.
Correct.
And we were discussing the three areas that they're focused on. And one was fiscal.
Right. Money, basically.
All right.
The other one was term limits, not just for the members of Congress. We already have that for the president, but also maybe for the Supreme Court or any other federal officials.
Well, and it's interesting that you point out we have that for the president, because we used to not have that for the president until a Democrat named President Roosevelt decided he was going to be there for 3 terms.
Well, it was 3 or 4 terms, I forget, but apparently the impact of the length of his terms motivated enough people to say we need to stop that,
And
because his power became so.
And that brings up a good point too. This is not the first time you hear about amending the Constitution and you go, God, that's got to be impossible. But it's happened, as you pointed out earlier, 26, 27 times.
Yeah, and it is difficult. It's not easy to do. In fact, what we see sometimes in some of the judicial opinions that we've seen is that instead of going through the amendment process, the courts will just say, well, we think this constitutional provision says that, so we're just going to call it that. And lawyers, even lawyers who don't do constitutional law on a regular basis, will look at that and go, no, that's not right.
All right, so let's back up. So we've talked about fiscal issues, we've talked about term limits.
Right.
Those fiscal issues are going to be a focus of the convention. Term limits of every kind of federal employee or representative.
Any officials of the federal government.
All right. And then finally we have
the power and limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and that's deliberately, I think, a very broad category of what other ways can we reel in the federal government. One of the things is these administrative regulations that are getting cranked out every year are getting more and more and more and more, and they're suffocating our economy more and more and more.
And it has the power of law, and sometimes, I'd say more often than not, Congress isn't even involved. They give this giant power to the president, who then sends it to his agencies and says, here, you guys draft the rules.
And one of the flaws that we're seeing is that the Congress never then uses its power to reel in these regulations and these regulatory agencies. And so that's the concept of limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government by some of these amendments, is let's come up with some ways to slow all that down, to reduce those regulations.
And once again, the whole big umbrella concept is power should be in the hands of the people, and when government's involved, if those individuals are exercising power as a government, they need to be close and accountable to the people.
And that's why the state legislatures are so critical in the distribution of power. You know, they taught us in school about the legislative and the executive and the judicial branches of government, but what they didn't, as the balance of powers,
right,
what they didn't talk about, the separation of powers, what they've forgotten to teach us about and what they've stopped talking about is this. Most of the power is supposed to be in the states. That's in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and we've kind of forgotten about that, in part because the Supreme Court has written it out.
And let's talk about just a broad overview real fast. The whole concept of our government is that the power comes from the people, and it goes to the states, and then the states give some very limited power to the federal government, and that was the purpose of the Constitution. It said the people have the power.
Right.
The people could give you states some powers, whatever they don't give you, they still have.
Right.
And states, you're going to give the federal government some power, and whatever you don't expressly give them, you still have.
Right.
And that's been turned upside down.
That has been absolutely turned upside down. That was the 10th Amendment to the Constitution that was put together in the Bill of Rights because, and frankly, if they had not done those Bill of Rights, we would not have a Constitution because so many states during the process were objecting to
giving up their power.
Giving up their power. And this was meant to make a clear statement that the federal government only has those powers that are expressly granted to them by the states. Remember, the states created this federal government, not vice versa, and that any powers not specifically given to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. That's the 10th Amendment.
That's the bottom line.
And it's being ignored.
And the tool that's been used the most has been the court system in the Supreme Court in particular, where they're interpreting the Commerce Clause or differing clauses that are in words in the Constitution and broadening them to a point that it's absurd. But that's where we are today.
Exactly. And that's what we, I mean, you and I are lawyers, we do this all the time. When we advocate for our clients, we're going to state a position that we think is the best for our particular clients, and we sometimes may push the envelope a little bit. Well, the Supreme Court is doing it more than that.
Yeah.
And
they're creating laws, the bottom line, and they're not supposed to. So let's shift gears a little bit. So there was actually, as I understand it, in the last week or so, a mock convention of the states, a simulated convention of the states.
Exactly.
Tell me about it.
In the third week of September, a simulated convention of states was held in historic Williamsburg, Virginia. They brought in delegates, legislators, invited legislators from all 50 states.
These are the real guys.
These are real guys.
These are guys that are sitting in the House or Senate of their state legislature.
State senator from Baton Rouge, state senator from Lafayette, representative from Chalmette. Three of the guys who were instrumental in passing the legislation here in Louisiana.
And representatives from all 50 states.
From all 50 states showed up.
Great.
And they did what we would expect the convention to do when it is eventually held. First, they had committee meetings for a day. This was short because it was a mock-up. It was a test run. They had committee meetings for a day to write these proposed amendments to the Constitution to give to the whole convention. And then the second day, and it was broadcast live on TV.
And
really
people
cool.
can go watch it now, right?
You can go back and see it on the website.
Okay.
There is a whole tab in the Convention of States website for the simulation, it's called.
Okay.
Test run, mock-up, we would call it. And then on the second day, they actually proposed and debated the amendments. And it's really cool. You can go back and listen to them argue about it.
I watched a little bit of it. And as I understand it, there were 9 proposed amendments that could have been passed by the Convention of States, and they only passed 6.
Right, and I think part of that was they ran out of time, but they passed 6, and they passed them by a majority vote. Some of them were overwhelmingly accepted. I think 45 votes and 44 votes for some of them, but some of them were more hotly debated, and frankly, the term limits one was hotly debated, but it was still passed, but only by 35 states.
So it was on those 3 major areas: fiscal issues, term limits, and then finally the power of the federal government, the jurisdiction of the federal government.
Exactly.
All right, so what do folks now do in Louisiana? Because, you know, when I first was reading about this, I go, well, heck, we've done what we need to. It's all over with. But that's not the case.
We've only done the first leg. What the legislature is going to be needing to do in the near future is select their delegates that they're going to send up. They're also going to be needing to write the rules that we were talking about. Here's the instructions that each of those commissioners is going to have to go. And that'll be key, because that'll tell them what we want to vote for and what we're not going to vote for. And then eventually, after the Convention of States is held and the proposals come out of the convention, whatever those might be,
to all 50 states.
To all 50 states.
They got to vote on it.
Then they got to vote it, ratify it. And 38 states have to ratify it. So if only 37 states ratify any of these.
Oh, this is waste of time.
Yeah. Now, but they will come out individually. If there are, for example, 6 proposed amendments that come out, each one of the 6 will be
voted on independently, separately. Fantastic. So what do folks do right now? Do they stay in contact with you guys, the website?
Go get on the Convention of States website. It'll pop up real quick. Do you want to sign the petition? And you'll get information. You'll have people contact you.
You stay plugged in, provide resources if
stay plugged in.
Want
Absolutely.
to.
You can go to the Convention of States Project on the Facebook. So there's lots of ways to get connected.
Fantastic. Dale, very much appreciate it.
Thank you,
This is Locke Meredith of Legal Lines. My special guest is Dale Clary. Talk about Convention of the States. Thank you for being with us.